I'm devastated. I love them. And I can't believe that this has happened, and I'm so sorry that they have lost their lives.
Police say you're a suspect. Do you have anything to say about
Yes,
that?
I say I didn't do anything. I love them.
Hi there folks, my name is Adrian, and today's case is one of those stories that's almost mundane to begin with. Think of a family meal around the kitchen table, and the sort of thing that usually ends with awkward small talk and tea before eventually settling down for TV. And that is how this story should have ended. But instead, it became an internationally recognized murder investigation. Now, I'm pretty sure that some of you will have even heard of this story before, because the person at the center of all of this was a seemingly ordinary, albeit dull woman named Erin Patterson. And Erin, well, she invited her former in-laws over for lunch. But the thing is, lunch wouldn't quite turn out to be lunch. Let's just say for now that menu came with a few unoptional extras. But before we begin, and just to let you know that I post true crime, strange and dark stories here weekly, so if that is your sort of thing, please do consider subscribing. I really appreciate it. And now, with that said, please grab yourself a coffee and let's caffeinate while we investigate. This is the case of Erin Patterson. Welcome to Melbourne, folks. Now, Melbourne needs no formal introduction, and I'm sure that you'll probably agree that I can be annoyingly enthusiastic about this place. I mean, it's my home for a reason, and everything you're seeing here is just a glimpse into what my life is like away from the Coffeehouse. Now, look, I'm not going to say that Melbourne is perfect. However, for someone who loves coffee, warm weather, culture, and good food, well, I believe this is the closest you can get. You've got the F1, the Australian Open, the Great Ocean Road, and seriously, more coffee shops than you can ever imagine visiting. I think we all have a place that we would eventually like to call home, and this is it for me. Now, another thing that Melbourne does very well is good healthcare. Not only has it scored 100 out of 100 for healthcare in major livability indexes, but Australia consistently ranks in the top 3 countries for healthcare internationally. And we all know how important health is, right? I mean, the quality of our lives can basically descend to nothing without it. I feel like it's something that we all start to take more seriously as we get older, and often wish that we would have got on top of it earlier. But part of that journey comes from finding the right doctor for us, and one who fits our schedules, our personalities, and our needs. And I'm not gonna lie, that can be quite difficult to find. And that's why I love this video's sponsor, ZocDoc, because ZocDoc is a free website that helps you find and book high quality and network doctors so you can find one that you love and one that fits you. ZocDoc basically fixes all of your typical troubles, like long wait times and distant appointments. It lets you book in-network appointments with over 150,000 providers across all 50 states. So, whether you need a dermatologist, dentist, primary care doctor, eye specialist, or one of the 200 plus other specialties on the platform, well, you can just search by specialty or even symptom and build the care team that actually fits you. Prefer seeing someone in person? Easy, no problem. Or maybe you want to do a video visit from the comfort of your very own home. That's fine too. And one of my favorite parts is that you can read thousands of verified patient reviews beforehand, so you're not going in blind. You can get a real sense of who your doctor is. Maybe they're chatty, or maybe they get straight to the point. Who knows, but at least you know what you're walking into. And when you're ready, you can see their real-time availability and just click to book. There's no phone call, no awkward back and forth, and no waiting around wondering if anyone actually picked up your voicemail. Appointments that are booked through ZocDoc usually happen fast too, often within just 24 to 72 hours, and sometimes even the very same day. If putting off appointments has become your personality trait, then it might be time to retire that habit and start looking after yourself today. And so, what are you waiting for? Click the link in the description or go to zocdoc.com/coffeehousecrime to find and instantly book a top-rated in-network doctor today. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video, and thank you to you folks for supporting us content creators. Genuinely, I really appreciate it. And now, let's get straight back to our video today, which, strangely enough, comes oddly close to their own healthcare. It was on a cool afternoon of July the 29th, 2023, that doctors in 2 regional hospitals here in Victoria, Australia, noticed something subtly unusual. Several patients had arrived within just a couple hours of each other, all from the same family, and all complaining of similar symptoms. Gail and Don Patterson had checked in at Dandenong Hospital, which is found about 30 miles southeast of Melbourne, and meanwhile, Heather and Ian Wilkinson had arrived at Leongatha Hospital 50 miles further. Now, at first glance, this looked like a brutal case of food poisoning, the kind that will ruin your weekend and make you swear that you will never eat that dish again. From the outside, it looked like that they were suffering from severe nausea, gnarly vomiting, and intense abdominal pain. However, when their symptoms didn't ease up and instead escalated to rather frightening levels, doctors knew that they had something unusual on their hands. And when they realized that multiple people were deteriorating all at the same pace and time, well, it was at that point that they started asking much harder questions. In the midst of their collapse, doctors scrambled to try to understand what on earth happened for them to feel so severely ill, and that is when they realized something. And it turns out that that lunch came as quite the surprise to a couple of them, because in the weeks leading up to that event, the relationship between Erin and the rest of her former husband's family had become quite strained and awkward at best. With the breakdown of their marriage and Erin being Erin, trust me, you'll know what I mean in a few moments, the vibe between them was no longer relaxed like it once used to be. And now, between the 5 of them that had attended that lunch, 4 of them were severely ill in hospital, and only 1 had no symptoms whatsoever. That being the chef. Now, it is worth highlighting here that on the same day as the lunch, Erin had also checked in at the hospital after reporting similar but milder symptoms. However, by evening, she had discharged herself and gone home. But isn't that strange though? Because while everybody else was getting worse, Erin felt not only good enough, but confident enough to return home. As the hours passed by, doctors realized that this was no longer behaving like food poisoning at all. Their patients were declining way too rapidly and severely. It was when those lab reports came back conclusive for alpha-aminitin, beta-aminitin, and phallotoxins that specialist doctors realized what they were likely dealing with, and that was a tiny fungus called death cap mushrooms, one of the most lethal natural poisons known to medicine. And suddenly, that quiet family lunch did not look like a simple case of bad cooking anymore. After realizing this, the detectives went all the way back to the start, right to the lunch itself. They looked at what they had eaten, who was exposed to it, if there were any leftovers, and, of course, if there could possibly be a motive. And that is when they realized that Erin had invited her former in-laws, Don and Gail, along with Gail's sister, Heather, and Heather's husband, Ian, and even her former husband over to her home in Leongatha. Now, Simon Patterson, who of course is Erin's estranged husband, who was also invited, had chosen not to attend at the last minute. At the time, it likely felt like it was just one of those slightly awkward post-separation dynamics. You know the type. You go, I'll skip it, we'll avoid the tension. Now, on paper, it sounded perfectly normal. Families fall out, reconcile, stay connected, and sometimes they still will meet for lunch even after relationships get messy. That in itself is not unusual. So, let's talk about the lunch. The meal served that day was Erin's famous beef Wellington, accompanied by mashed potatoes and green beans. Which isn't an elaborate dish, to be honest with you, but also it's not exactly a quick throw something in the oven type situation either. I would say that beef Wellington is the kind of meal that you cook when you would like to impress people. Or apparently, when you would like to star in one of the most infamous poisoning cases in modern Australian history. Anyway, the afternoon went ahead smoothly. Everyone sat down, ate together, chatted, and then eventually left to get on with their Sunday. There were no immediate collapses, no dramatic reactions, and no one pushing their plate away in disgust. By all means, it was just an ordinary Sunday lunch. However, within hours, and as we all know by now, all of that normality suddenly began to unravel. And one by one, all of her guests became violently ill. And it all pointed back towards Erin. Speaking about Erin, I have to say that she is one of the most interesting yet boring characters that I've ever covered here. Now, I'll get into more details later in this video, but if I had to describe her as a meal, well, she would not be a beef Wellington. I think soggy white bread is more fitting for her, with a thin slice of unsalted butter. Seriously, if blandness were a competitive sport, then she would absolutely win gold. Okay, in more fairness to her, on the surface, she did not present as the sort of person that you'd expect to find at the center of a story about mass poisoning. She was just a mother living in regional Victoria who was leading what looked like a relatively ordinary suburban life. There was no dramatic criminal history and no long trail of violent behavior either. She was just someone who, to neighbors and acquaintances, appeared to be very unremarkable. Now, although Erin had been married to Simon Patterson, who, of course, was the son of Don and Gail Patterson, their relationship had sadly broken down in the years prior. However, despite their separation, she still remained in contact with Simon's parents, and on the face of it, that dynamic seemed perfectly fine. They were still the grandparents to her daughter, of course, and as for Erin, she had tragically lost her own mother only a few years prior. Now, don't get me wrong, it certainly was strained at times, but not outwardly hostile, and that's partly what made her random lunch invitation seem so normal to the rest of the family. She was just a separated mother who was inviting her former in-laws over to talk, reconnect, and maybe smooth things over. Friends and family describe Erin as someone who was, at times, particular, controlled, and keenly aware of how she presented herself. She wasn't eccentric or dramatic, she was just deliberate. The kind of person who seemed composed on the surface, even when the situation around her was anything but. So, going back to lunch yet again, doctors were alarmed to see that not only had the toxicology reports come back with positive traces of alpha-aminotin and extremely high ALT levels in their livers, but their symptoms almost perfectly aligned with poisoning from, I'm gonna pronounce this wrong, Amanita phalloides. Now, of course, that is more commonly known as the death cap mushroom, a species that is so toxic that even eating a small amount can quite literally destroy your liver beyond repair. They are quite interesting, to be honest with you, and they're actually something that I was never aware about before this story. They don't grow in dark, forbidden forests or hard-to-reach caves either. They just grow quietly in ordinary places like under oak trees in suburban parks, along footpaths, and even in gardens. Originating from Europe, they have found a comfortable home in parts of Australia, and to an untrained eye, they don't look sinister at all. In fact, from what I've heard, they don't even taste bad. They just sit there waiting to be eaten, and of course, that is what makes them so dangerous. As the hours turned into days, time served no kindness to any of them, and tragically, Don and Gail would pass away next to each other, and Heather would follow shortly afterwards due to severe organ failure. And although her husband Ian would thankfully survive, he had a very long road ahead of him in intensive care. And so, over the space of only a couple of days, one single meal had effectively wiped out multiple members of the same family. And strangely, the chef was totally fine. It is no surprise to see then that eventually detectives turned their heads towards Erin, and the way that she handled the interview and the news was, well, I'll just let you see for yourself.
It's a tragedy what's happened.
Can you tell us about the meal that you cooked?
I'm so devastated by what's happened, by the loss of Don. Don is still in hospital, the loss of Ian and Heather and Gail. They were some of the best people that I've ever met. Gail was like...
Take your time.
Gail was the mum that I didn't have because my mum passed away 4 years ago. And Gail's never been anything but good and kind to me. And Ian and Heather were some of the best people I've ever met. They never did anything wrong to me, and I'm so devastated about what's happened. I'm devastated. I love them. And I can't believe that this has happened, and I'm so sorry that they have lost their lives.
Were they picked from the property area?
I just ask you to leave me alone now, please.
Police say you're a suspect. Do you have anything to say about
Yes,
that?
I say I didn't do anything. I love them. And I'm devastated that they're gone. And I hope with every fibre of my being that Don pulls through. That's
Where
what I
do the
have to
mushrooms
say.
come from? Were they picked by you, or where did they come from, Erin? Can you tell us? What meal did you cook them? Did you eat the same meal, Erin?
Can anyone say crocodile tears? And so, with 3 deaths and 1 very suspicious-looking chef, detectives now had the complex task of proving if Erin was guilty or just plain stupid. But where do you even begin with a story like this? Because by now they were pretty sure that it was death cap mushrooms. But how do you prove if this was an accident or if it was something far more nefarious? And of course, the problem is that these mushrooms are naturally sourced, meaning there is no bank statement, receipt, or surveillance footage to prove there was a crime. So what are they supposed to do? Well, as it turns out, Erin would actually make so many of her own mistakes that she would basically prove it for them. As they began their early investigations, detectives found that the meal may have contained a mixture of both store-bought mushrooms and others that were foraged. And that was a very crucial piece of information, because that distinction would end up mattering a lot. If toxic mushrooms had accidentally been gathered and then mixed into the meal, this case could actually point towards a catastrophic mistake. However, if they had instead been knowingly sourced, dried, or stored beforehand, well, that's when things started to feel less like a kitchen accident and more like a deliberate menu choice. So, with this now being an active case that did involve numerous deaths, not necessarily homicide, but indeed deaths, police decided that it was finally time to interview Erin on the lunch. And I'm not sure what you're going to think about this one, but to me, she looks incredibly displeased to be there. And also, why is she blinking so often?
Following eating at your house, Donald, Ian, Gail and Heather all become so ill that they ultimately ended up in the intensive care unit at both the Daniel Hospital and then moved to the Austin Hospital. Right. Following that, they had a deterioration in their condition, and that they become so ill that their livers have failed. Right. Okay. Heather and Gail passed away. Conversely, we're trying to understand why you're not that ill. Right? So you understand why we're interviewing you today?
Yeah, I do. But I'm sure you understand too that, like, I've never been in a situation like this before, and I've been very, very helpful with the health department through the week because I wanted to help that side of things as much as possible, because I do want to know what happened. So I've given them as much information as they've asked for and offered up all the food and all the information about where the food came from.
Obviously we've got concerns in relation to these mushrooms and where they've come from. Okay. Is that something you've done in the past, foraging for the mushrooms or anything like that? Never. You were at home and present when we did a search warrant today, right? I know you weren't watching everyone at all the time, but I just want to go through on tape some of the stuff we've, and like I said, we'll give you a copy of this, everything we've seized. Kitchen, far left bottom drawer, instruction manual for a sunbeam, food lab, electronic dehydrator. What's that in relation to? Do you know anything about a dehydrator in your house? Or?
So, police began working backwards through the timeline. They started by looking through Erin's shopping records, her phone data, and her movements in and around Leongatha and nearby towns. Basically anything that could help them reconstruct her movements. And of course, that included surveillance footage. As you may have caught on in that interview, it was in the middle of their investigation of Erin's home that one of the officers found a manual for a food dehydrator, which up until this point in time had done absolutely nothing wrong in its life. But little did the poor old dehydrator know that it was about to become one of the most discussed appliances in Australian criminal history. So, what precisely is a food dehydrator? Well, it's kind of self-explanatory because it's in the name. At its most basic level, it's essentially used to remove moisture from food by slowly circulating warm air until ingredients become dried and preserved. People will use them for all sorts of things like fruit slices, jerky, and herbs. It's not exactly the kind of device that you'd associate with a homicide investigation. In fact, I don't think I've ever heard anyone using this in true crime before, yet here we are. So thanks, Erin. And as investigators looked closer at how the meal may have been prepared, they began to consider that maybe the mushrooms weren't used fresh at all. And when forensics analyzed the kitchen, they realized that, although the dehumidifier was missing, there were several items linked to that dehumidifier that did in fact contain traces consistent with death cap mushrooms. And moving away from the crime scene for a moment, doctors were not entirely reassured by Erin's behavior either. Now, it is true that she did in fact attend the hospital on the same day as the others were checked in, but it's also true that she left far more quickly than even medical staff were comfortable with. In fact, her early discharge would raise enough concern that doctors later questioned whether she had fully grasped the severity of what she was actually dealing with. This was one of the main things that stuck out to me, because if there was even a small chance that she had been exposed to the same toxin, then most people would beg to stay at the hospital. And so, after checking herself out from the hospital, doctors had this conversation with the police.
So this is Dr. Chris Webster calling from Leongatha Hospital, and I have a concern regarding a patient that presented here earlier but has left the building and is potentially exposed to a fatal toxin from mushroom poisoning, and I've tried several times to get hold of her on her mobile phone.
So before I get all that information in, what address do you need the police to attend, Dr. Chris?
Yeah, so, well, should I give the hospital address or the address of the patient?
If you know where they are, their address.
I have the address of the patient.
Yeah, go ahead with that.
Okay.
What's her name?
So the last name is Patterson.
First name?
Erin.
Mushroom poisoning, you said.
Yeah, so there were 5 people that ate a meal on Saturday, and 2 of them are in intensive care at Dandenong Hospital. 2 have just been transferred from Leongatha Hospital to Dandenong Hospital, and Erin presented this morning with symptoms of poisoning.
And what happened when she presented? She just got up and left?
No, there was time for the nurse to begin observations, and I was managing the other critically unwell patient, so I had a brief chat to her about where the mushrooms were obtained, and after that, while I was attending the other patients, the nurse informed me that she had discharged herself against medical advice.
And that wasn't all, it turns out, because then came the surveillance footage, and as you will see, it is probably some of the most damning evidence that Erin would have to face. While investigators were tracking Erin's movements in the days and weeks before and after their deaths, they found something interesting. It was only 4 days after that fateful lunch that a surveillance camera at a local tip would spot Erin's car pulling up. With very typical Australian countryside in the background, Erin is then seen getting out of the car and then picking up a dehydrator from the boot. She is then seen dumping it in the warehouse before then returning to her car and driving away. Now, look, outside of environmental factors, throwing away a kitchen appliance is not automatically naughty. But when you throw away a dehydrator shortly after a deadly mushroom poisoning, well, that is one way of making yourself known to the police. Oh, and just to be explicit here, the manual that they found in the house was for the exact model that she had dumped in this warehouse and then lied about not having. And that wasn't it, because only 45 minutes after the family lunch, a surveillance camera captured her disposing of cardboard at the local tip. Unfortunately, that cardboard was never actually found, so we don't know what it contained. But what it does show is someone who is potentially trying to remove evidence. Even still, as all of these details became known to the general public, the overall tone of this case changed quite dramatically. In fact, I even remember hearing about this case when it happened, and how the general opinion went from believing it was just an accident to thinking that maybe Erin did actually have something to do with it. And that's not it either, because around the same time, there were other things coming out too. For example, there was this text message, which basically confirms that Erin was sneaking mushrooms into the kids' brownies. Now, of course, those mushrooms were totally normal because those kids are absolutely fine. However, what it does show is that Erin was sneakily trying to put things unknowingly into people's food. And speaking of mobile phones, that wasn't the end of it. So, what you're currently watching right now is body cam footage of detectives taking Erin's phone away from her in the days after the murders. The detective at the table then asks for her PIN code, where she gives him one number and then another. And it turns out that both of them were actually incorrect, because this device did not have a PIN at all. Which is a slightly odd mistake to make, right? Because most of us will use our phone code dozens of times a day. In a way, it's kind of like muscle memory. So, to confidently provide 2 wrong codes for a phone that apparently didn't require one, that kind of raises an eyebrow. And that's actually because this was not her usual phone at all, but a secondary device. In other words, it was a dummy phone. How's that for innocent?
So it's 3:29 p.m. on the 5th of August 2023. Thanks for your patience today, Erin. We're completing our search. The only outstanding item is that mobile phone that you've got there. So I'll seize that now from you. Is there a PIN code on your phone?
Yeah.
Do you know what it is?
It's either 1315 or 131528. I can't remember which one.
There's a provision in the warrant that requires you to assist us to get into these devices.
Is it opening? Oh, okay, well,
Don't know one, mate.
no one, so there you go.
There
Your
you go.
job's easy.
Yeah.
It is kind of obvious how this story went. In November of 2023, and after multiple months of investigations, Victoria Police officially arrested Erin Patterson and charged her with 3 counts of murder relating to the deaths of Don and Gail Patterson and Heather Wilkinson. And on top of that, they added 1 count of attempted murder. Now, of course, Erin would plead not guilty because, even from the get-go, she always played the victim card extraordinarily well. The prosecution believed that Erin had planned and prepared a meal with clear intent. However, Erin and her defense team would push back strongly here. They argued that the poisoning had been a total accident, and that her behavior afterwards had been interpreted incorrectly. They emphasized that she was actually a victim in this too, just as much as the others were, that she must have a good immune system, and that she was just lucky. They of course would also emphasize that her estranged husband Simon hadn't even attended the lunch, and they argued that if she really wanted revenge against him and really wanted custody over everything, then she would have made sure that he would have gone down with his family. Either way, I bet that he feels incredibly fortunate not to attend last minute, but of course he must now deal with so much grief, loss and pain. One piece of evidence that had to be excluded from court, but one that I think is very telling, is the document that was found on Erin's phone. I'm not sure why this was disqualified, but investigators found a document titled Homicidal Poisons on her phone, and obviously, it shows some clear knowledge or awareness of what was to come. Her husband would also testify that in the months and years leading up to the divorce, he had even become suspicious of Erin trying to poison him. In fact, he had become so paranoid about it that he even stopped eating her meals altogether. And Ian Wilkinson, who was the only one to survive that lunch, was also there to testify. And given the circumstances, he was very calm, composed, and factual. He would also confirm that the lunch felt quite ordinary, and that no one felt awkward or uncomfortable. It is clear that everyone trusted Erin, and that Erin seemed her usual self. So, after weeks of being on trial, the jury would finally return with their verdict, and in the end, they found her guilty on all 3 counts of murder, with an additional 1 count of attempted murder. The judge described her crimes as deliberate and devastating, and carried out under the ordinary facade of a shared family meal. And I think that's the part that really sucks here, because Erin murdered her own family through an act of kindness and nurture. She was therefore sentenced to life in prison with a non-parole period of 33 years, meaning that, with time already partially served, she could be free in the year 2056. However, by then, she will be 82 years old. As the verdict was read out, Erin just sat there with a flat, vacant expression. You would hope in moments like this she might actually be reflecting. However, it is hard to escape the feeling that nothing was going on in there. But the weird part about this story is that, even to this day, nobody quite understands why Erin wanted to murder all 4 of her guests. I mean, by now, we know that she undoubtedly did. But still, why? During her sentencing, the judge was sure to highlight how much premeditation went into this rather creative way of mass murder. and so it was clear that there was a lot of emotion and planning behind Erin's actions. However, those emotions don't actually point towards anything in particular, and so many of us are still left wondering. Of course, we do know that Erin was actually going through a divorce at the time. However, her ex-husband was not there on the day of the murders, and as far as money goes, he didn't have any sort of life insurance either. And so, the only real motive we can go with is just meaningless petty revenge. There's something unsettling about the way that this case unfolded. Like, there was no big explosive argument or any obvious warning sign. It was all just a polite invitation for lunch made by an ordinary family member that then spiraled into mass murder. In its own way, that actually makes it feel even more terrifying, because as soon as trust and deceit come into the mix, it always makes you want to second-guess everything. Now, on the positive side, most dinner hosts won't usually treat beef Wellington like a chemistry experiment gone wrong, so I do think that you're probably fine at your next Sunday roast. Of course, so long the chef's name isn't Erin. I feel bad for her victims too, because this is not only about the moment that they died, but everything that they were supposed to be forever afterwards. Their lives wouldn't only end that day, but their futures were erased too. And what makes it even more heartbreaking is that they didn't go to that lunch expecting any danger whatsoever. They merely went as family and trusting the person who invited them. You know, with so many strange and peculiar details around this case, I wouldn't be surprised if this remains as one of Melbourne's most notorious murder stories for many decades to come. In fact, in the months and years that followed, the town of Leongatha saw a tourism boom worth millions of dollars due to the case's notoriety, which is insane when you think about it. But of course, the largest impact here is not on the town itself, but on its victims and their families. And I just hope that they're okay and that they'll find peace moving forward. Anyway, folks, I think that pretty much concludes our story today. And I just want to say thank you so much for being here, because I really do appreciate it. Before you go though, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, so as always, please share them in the comments down below. And again, thank you to ZocDoc for sponsoring this video. Go to ZocDoc.com/coffeehousecrime to find and book a top-rated in-network doctor today. Anyway folks, I'll see you again very soon for another video, but until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves and of course, each other, and stay safe. Thank you, and goodbye.